Well, hello everyone out there, and welcome back to my channel. This is Mark Turi. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who messaged me and was wondering what happened on Wednesday. Just very briefly, I'll go over that when I get a few more people on the channel, but nothing serious. But I'll go through that because so far we don't have anyone watching. But of course, I will get into that in a moment. Just again, knowing that nothing serious happened. But I thank everyone. I deeply apologize for having to cancel that on Wednesday, just a few hours before go time. So again, thank you for bearing with me, and we will be doing that. Uh, what I was going to present on Wednesday. We'll be forwarding that for 2 weeks, and I will be giving that presentation now on the 18th of December. But yeah, nothing dramatic happened, nothing drastic happened. Just unfortunately a conflict in the schedule, so to speak. So that was all that happened. And again, I thank everyone who messaged, who had any concerns. I know Shell messaged, Joe and Chad messaged, and a few others, Peter as well. So thank you all for acknowledging that. And as I said, it was just unfortunately a schedule conflict that involved, by the way, I might as well divulge, which I can probably do again once more people are online. But last Wednesday, I just had to make a FaceTime call with someone, and unfortunately, they were only available on Wednesday during our regular time. So it was very unusual, and that will not happen again. Unfortunately, it did happen just this once. So again, any apologies for anyone who wanted to see me on Wednesday, but we are going to postpone what I was going to do on Wednesday for 2 weeks from today, which is the 18th. Power lines to paralyze. How are you? Good to see you here. Again, I was just briefly going over why we didn't have, or why I wasn't able to do a stream last Wednesday. And again, you can go over to the 2 minutes and 36 seconds and just say that I was just unfortunately busy for a very unusual reason that will probably not affect any of us in the future, which is good, sort of a one time thing. But um, I just wanted, of course, to say, like I normally do, that I am like to grow my channel. So please, if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, I'm hoping that you consider doing that, especially if you enjoy my content like this. If you enjoy things that have to do with philosophy, religion, politics, looking at groups like Scientology and breaking down ideas, whether they're religious ideas, theological ideas, philosophical ideas, secular ideas, and even political ideas, which is what we are going to be doing today, then please consider subscribing. And also, if you are on right now and you haven't yet liked this video, please do so. I always get more likes than dislikes. So that's always nice. And I know a lot of people who like my videos are, some of my fans and followers here, and I always appreciate every single one of you. So, that's a good thing. And hopefully in the future, as I grow and I get more, subscribers and stuff like that, I'll keep in mind my Mark Postles, the top 12 of my personal favorite followers. I already have that list maybe halfway done, so we'll have to figure out the other half in the future. But I do appreciate your time, and I do appreciate you being here. Of course, we do have a Mark Postle front and center, Irish Mart. I like your pick, your new picture. That's it looks really funny. Let me just enlarge to make sure I know what I'm talking about here. Yeah, nice hat there. A Rudolph hat, I guess, right? Irish Mart. Um, looks really funny and really, really nice as well. But yeah, just in case you're coming on right now, I just made a brief statement just 2 minutes ago about why I was unfortunately unable to join on Wednesday. But please understand, there wasn't anything Um, wasn't anything that bad happened. I just had to take like a call, FaceTime call, and the person, which was quite urgent and important, could only do it during the time that we had you know, our thing. So it's unusual, and that won't happen again. I've told the person not to do that, and so again, sort of a rarity for me to break the schedule. Uh, that's so soon before we start. But again, my apologies. So in that case, again, our schedule is going to be, and I will, as I normally do, once before we finish the live here, I will go and talk about it one more time. But of course, today we have our um, this topic, which is the different types of socialism and Marxism, which I think is a very interesting topic that, of course, we've touched on before when I talked about the different schools of history between Marx and Popper, the two Karls, Karl Marx and Karl Popper. When we talked about things like historical materialism and so on, and then Popper's critiques of Karl Marx. We talked a lot about Marxism. And then, of course, what we talked about reform versus revolution when the revolution didn't happen. So, what happened when the revolution didn't happen? And we expanded the idea of just orthodox, a classical Marxism, and also talked about a Marxism-Leninism. So, we're going to get into that. Um, the following Wednesday, as some of you know, because I've mentioned it a couple times, is the 11th of December. It is the 1 year anniversary of the passing of our friend Doug Scott Kramer. And so I'm going to do a 1 hour or more, as I normally do, kind of, I guess, memorial for him on the anniversary of his passing. I want to celebrate his life and his career as an actor and get into some sort of personal things about like why I became friends with him and how grateful I was to know him and be his friend, even though I don't think I knew him more than 2 years. You know, but how much he helped me and so forth. And that's going to be a quite an interesting, I think, and very deep, celebration of his life. And also that day, I think there'll be other channels which will do some kind of dedication to him. So I might be on those. Before mine, I'm not sure. After mine, we'll figure out the schedule. But I'm hoping to be on other on channels discussing Doug's life. And then after that, next week, this time on the 14th, we're going to do a PowerPoint presentation. And I decided we're going to break down the different types of libertarianism and anarchism. And then after that, the 18th, we're going to go on with the different types of history, which will actually be a part 2 of the part 1, which is when we discussed things like Karl Marx and Karl Popper. So that will be the schedule until the holidays, and then we'll take a break for the holidays, and I'll most likely be back sometime in January. I may or may not have a schedule change in January, but even if I do, it won't be terribly dramatic, and I'll let you all know about that. Um, again, it probably won't affect anything too much, so we can still enjoy my content and so on. But I'll let you know if that happens in the future. And really, that's all I do want to say as far as, I like to start with small talk and sort of an introduction on what's going on. The weather has been pretty consistent, anywhere from 0 to 10 degrees Celsius. So that's between maybe 30 and 50, let's say, degrees Fahrenheit for our American friends. Around there, give or take, of course, a couple degrees here and there. But yesterday it was actually snowing, and it was really snowing quite hard, which normally in Hungary, it doesn't snow that much. And usually when it does, it's very light flurries, which just means, it's almost like the equivalent of drizzle or light rain, if you know rain, which is like flurries, right? Which is just, again, very light, and it doesn't really do anything or distract anything. But we had a very heavy snowfall, except what's very interesting is that the snow does not stay on the ground here. So as soon as the snow touches the ground, it turns to water, unlike where I grew up in Canada, where we have packing snow, and this is where you get the snow mountains and all this kind of stuff. But it was really interesting because as I was out at the time, I started my day, and started to get out just before it started to snow. So when it was snowing, I was outside, and I was taking a look at a whole bunch of people walking down the street and so forth. Um, and people were taking photos and FaceTiming with I guess with relatives or friends or something, and also making videos on their cell phone for looking at all the snow because again, as much as we got is actually pretty uh, pretty rare. So anyway, it was interesting, and I just personally don't like the snow, but I guess I kind of understand people who've never seen it before. It is a really interesting phenomenon. I'm just tired of it. That's all. But that's just me. Irish Mart says I'm embarrassed to say how many selfies it took while he didn't have a startled look. I have an inbuilt aversion to having my picture taken. I'm with you there. In layman's terms, it's cold. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's what it was like here. And it's the winter, it's dark at 3, 4 o'clock, and all that stuff. But still running along, still poking along, still doing what I need to do. Meetings, writing, the snow, Christmas markets again. I went twice this week to get to the Christmas markets. Not much food I can eat there because it's all mostly pork sausages and pork products. And also, if they have like beef ribs or something, it's not kosher. So I normally just get the wine, of course, the mulled wine or the vooruitgeboorte, as we call it, and then see if I can just get um, other stuff, without meat. Usually they have vegetables and sometimes cabbage rolls, which I enjoy with rice inside. So most of the vegetarian food, which they do have. So I had a couple of cabbage rolls with rice inside, vegetables inside, and also paprika and sour cream, and they tasted like my grandmother's. So that was really nice. So yeah, other than that, nothing too much. And again, we'll be back the following Wednesday, the 11th, for our memorial to our friend Doug Scott Kramer. 1 week from today, I will do another PowerPoint breaking down the different types of libertarianism and anarchism. And then, of course, on the 18th, we will conclude for this year, before the holidays, with what I was going to do last week, which is a second part of a history PowerPoint where we will break down, or it may not be a PowerPoint, but you understand what I mean, where I will break down the different types of history. What is political history, social history, business history, econ history, or economic history, I mean, and so forth, and how we apply those things and so on. Okay, so this is a good place to start because it's after 10 minutes. So I'm going to jump now to my PowerPoint. And as I always like to say, I have to go full screen, and unfortunately, StreamYard does not let me see both the chat when I'm in full screen. I don't know how to change that. So, just letting you know that if you have any questions, it might be a few minutes, and every couple slides, I will, come back. So please leave your messages. Please leave your questions, your comments, or whatnot. And then it might just take a few minutes for me to respond. I do want to also say hello to another exalted Mark Possel. This is Shell, my partner in memes, and well, in Star Trek meme exchanges, which we do several times a week. I hope you're well, Shell. I know. I hope your hand is okay. I hope you can get back to work as soon as possible, and that everything is all right on your end. I yeah, just wish you all the best, and hopefully it hasn't been too bad. I guess being home. I guess other than maybe having a hand injury with pain or whatever. I'm not sure what's going on, but again, just sort of hoping that everything is okay now, and we'll get better in the future. So thank you for being here. Appreciate that so much. Again, we have how many Mark Postles? We have at least two. I don't want to leave anybody out, so you can apply for a position if you want. I will take your resume. but we at least have a couple a couple here today. All right, now it's time to go to our presentation. Hey, there we go, Pete. You literally just Peter, you just logged in at the right time. Another Mark Postle. I'm literally just starting with my presentation after the intro. So, um, as I mentioned earlier, we have talked about some of these topics prior. The first one we talked about a few months ago when I gave a PowerPoint, which I know I mentioned earlier, but I'll mention again for those that have just logged on. Um, when we talked about the different schools of history and the philosophy of history is what I mean, and I referred to and talked about the Karl Marx sort of school of history called historical materialism and or dialectal materialism, and then also Karl Popper, who talked about historicism. And I did get into different types of communism and Marxism then, but we're going to go into it a little bit more. The other thing is, of course, also a few months ago, I did the presentation that was sort of a continuation of the Karl Marx, Karl Popper presentation, which we discussed and talked about um, the sort of the differences. What was that one again? There was the Marxist one, and then there was the I am losing my sense of thought. So we had the one on the schools of history, and then we had what happened when the revolution didn't happen. Forgive me. So what happened when the revolution didn't happen? And we talked about the difference between reform, socialism, and then like radical kind of more, revolution. So just being said, we have touched on these before, but I'm going to get into more detail with different types here. The other thing I want to say is, as I normally do, these definitions, number one, they do come from philosophybasics.com. I want to promote that because it's an incredible website that is very easy to use and very easy to understand. And they do an incredible job breaking down a lot of these different definitions. And unlike other philosophy websites and so forth, I find that they don't use hard academic type words that alienate people from learning philosophy because it is quite a heavy intellectual topic. Obviously, there's other heavy topics like for me, physics and whatnot. I goes over my head, but at least in this case, philosophy is broken down and they use very good terminology and so forth. So I like philosophy basics. And then I'm not using always 100% of the definition because of time, because of putting these PowerPoints together, I've had to cut down a little bit. So if you want more information, more detailed information, again, I very much encourage you to go to philosophybasics.com. And I also have not, because there's a lot of different types of both of these things. I've focused on mainly the main and more popular types of these ideas, and then also some more ones that I find interesting. So you might also find if you go to philosophybasics.com that for each section, for each socialism, Marxism, I haven't included all of them. Just a few might be missing. But first of all, let's get down to sort of what the word means, and this is where I always like to start when I break down ideas, which I gave a video a few weeks back saying as much, which is I enjoy starting with what is the definition of the word. So I've used two sources here. The first source is from Philosophy Basics, and the second is from the Merriam-Webster's Dictionary. So, according to philosophybasics.com, socialism is a socioeconomic system in which property and the distribution of wealth are subject to control by the workers, either directly through popular collectives, such as workers' councils, or indirectly exercised on behalf of the people by the state. The second definition from Merriam-Webster says that socialism is a system of society or group of living or group living, excuse me, in which there is no private property, as a system or condition of society in which the means of production are owned and controlled by the state. Now, the other definition, the most basic definition, is actually that socialism believes in the public social and or collective, okay, and or state um, ownership of the means of production. And so when we think about the means of production, we have to think about things like goods and services. We can think about factories, farming. We can think about things like banks and other service industries. And instead of being owned privately, which is the definition of capitalism, it's private ownership of the means of production. Private in this case means owned by individuals, and individuals which own businesses and companies, including corporations, and they are responsible for the distribution of goods and services, and of course, um, the means of production. But in a socialist system, again, it's usually collectively owned, could be by unions or workers. It's also could be owned socially, could be owned by the state, and it could be owned publicly just by a group of people in kind of a democracy type thing. And so that's the term of socialism. So this is what all of these types are going to have in common, is that it's essentially a society or a system of economics where there is no private property. I also want to mention the term personal property, because philosophically we tend to think of personal property and private property as the same, because in our society, which is mainly, I would say, mixed market, we definitely have some socialist aspects of Western whatever you want to say, Western democracies or high income nations. But of course, we also have a capitalist market system with regulations and all that kind of stuff. So we kind of have both in our society. But we definitely know that there have been states in history that have veered towards one or the other, and it hasn't been so good. And so this is where we get the idea of a mixed market economy. And for those who want to know about the next group, which is called social democracy, um, I may probably actually should incorporate that sometime next week, because what I find is a lot of people confuse social democracy with socialism, and I'll get into that in a moment. Social democracy, what I mean is the Nordic model. So Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Iceland have a very robust welfare state. They do have a capitalist economy, but they also have high redistribution of wealth, strong social systems, universal healthcare, universal education, and so forth. And so there's a debate on whether or not that is or isn't socialism. And I think that per the definition of socialism, it is not. I think that's more mixed market and has some socialist aspects, but mainly is a form of capitalism. So I'm going to specifically, again, talk about socialism. So societies that theorize or make some kind of hypothetical drive or so forth towards no private property, and that could mean personal property, which personal property, you know, in some socialist systems there is personal property, and some there isn't. So we can get into that in a moment. But essentially, this is what we mean. We think of society, socialism. Let's think of no private property, and let's think of either public, social, collective, or state ownership of the means of production. When most of us, again, think of socialism, this term comes up quite a lot, which is democratic socialism. For those that live in the United States or know a lot about the United States a political system, you'll know that Vermont's senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders, over the past 10, 15 years, especially since the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was back, I believe, in like 2008 to 2010, popularized the term democratic, or repopularized, I should say, brought the term back into our modern, culture, especially in the United States, of democratic socialism. He would say that democratic socialism is not socialism, it's different. Now, I think that Bernie Sanders was actually should have used the term social democracy, and that although many people who are philosophically socialist and even Marxist may end up advocating for social democratic policies, in order to make step by step increments towards more socialism. I think that unfortunately a lot of people probably got very, what's the word, scared when they hear the word socialism, because in America that kind of, is a kind of a buzzword for communism and a dog whistle or whatever. But there is such a thing as democratic socialism, which does, by the way, differ quite a bit from social democracy. So, democratic socialism advocates socialism, so public, etc., ownership of the means of production, as an economic principle. So, again, the means of production should be in the hands of ordinary working people, is their belief. So, we might say public, or I guess common ownership in this case. And democracy as a governing principle, political power should be in the hands of the people, democratically through a cooperative commonwealth or republic. And again, this is where we will get into um, things like reform socialism, that incrementalist socialism, which is an opposite to revolutionary socialism. It attempts to bring socialism through peaceful democratic means as opposed to violent insurrection, and represents the reformist tradition of socialism. So again, when I go back to the what happened when the revolution didn't happen, I mentioned the reform school, and just to be very brief again, small incremental changes, as I mentioned before, peaceful democratic means, get into parliament, get into some kind of political system, create a party, and get involved, be a mayor, be a senator, be the president, be the prime minister, be an MP, member of parliament, or whatever, um, and slowly but surely introduce some of these progressive or socialist policies, and then hopefully down the line it will lead to more socialism in the future, as opposed to one day from the next have some violent insurrection, overthrow the government, and throw the baby out with the bathwater. It says here that democratic socialism, by contrast, implies an ideology that is more left wing and supportive of a fully socialist system established either by gradual reforming capitalism within, or by some form of revolutionary transformation. And that in that case, it means more internal than external. Before we go on, oh, hey there, Huckleberry. How are you? That's me reckoning my ability to read thanks to social democracy. That's good. But anyway, some people say it's semantics. I don't know. I mean, to me, fuck, fuck. Okay, here we go. I don't know what the heck happened. I think I froze for about a minute, and I might have sworn, so I apologize. That was weird, guys. Okay, I do not know what's going on. Okay, I think I'm back. Am I back? Yeah, okay. I didn't freeze. Okay, on my end, it looked like I was frozen. I don't know what's happening. Okay. Okay, sorry everybody. Something's happening. Okay, am I back now? Okay. Sorry, everybody. I'm having some technical issues. I apologize. My browser was freezing for some reason, and I'm going to put back my slides and we'll go on. So I apologize for that. That's actually never happened live. So consider yourself lucky. We've had the first time I've had live technical issues of my browser freezing and then unfreezing. If I swore, I apologize, but I do swear sometimes. Hopefully it working. Okay, anyway, it seems to be working. So think of democratic socialism. Um, Again, we have to think of socialism. It does differ from social democracy. I think more people are gradually getting into that because certainly when like in Europe, I can tell you that like most Swedish people don't consider their country socialist. And it's kind of an American, Canadian, maybe Australian colloquial term. When we think of socialism, we think of like free education and universal healthcare, but just know that there's more. And again, if you use the term colloquially, I have no control over that. But we are here talking about, strict sort of dictionary definitions. So now the next one is market socialism. And on this channel, you can go back to a video that I did about Yugoslavia, which was called Memories of State Socialism in Yugoslavia, based on a presentation that I did in a Yugoslavian history class. I think it was a year, maybe a year and a half ago. So it was a graduate, master's class or part of my master's program. And I showed pictures of myself when I was 6 and so forth. But we talked a lot about Tito, and Tito was someone who advocated and established in some successful ways, although limited in its amount of time, but at least for some time, the market socialist system in Yugoslavia did work, and then it was spread to places like Russia under Glasnost, and we had Gulag communism here in Hungary. But market socialism is a term used to define an economic system in which there is a market economy directed and guided by socialist planners, and where prices would be set through trial and error, making adjustments as shortages and surpluses occur, rather than relying on free price mechanism. By contrast, the socialist market economy, such as that practiced in the People's Republic of China, in one where major industries are owned by state entities, but compete with each other within a pricing system set by the market, and the state does not routinely intervene in the setting of prices. So we talked about this where when we talk about the public ownership of the means of production, all of those things I mentioned, whether it's factories, farms, banks, grocery stores, whatever we rely on now as far as goods and services, which are normally private, we do have public goods, right? Utilities and so forth. And there are government owned industries. Like in Canada, we have national insurance. So health insurance is actually, government based, and you have some of that in the United States, and we have some of that all over. But most foods and whatever, and our financials and whatever are in a market. But instead of being owned by private individuals, companies, corporations, businesses, etc., they would be in the hands of workers owned collective commonwealths and co-ops, and then they would be the ones who would be competing, and they would be the ones who would be setting prices by the market. So instead of thinking of all supermarkets, or all banks or all auto body shops being owned by a private individual or company or corporation group, meaning group of individuals, yeah, it would be owned by the workers who worked there, and they would probably split salary, working duties, and whatnot. So we talked about that again. So that is what market socialism is. It's very interesting because it rejects central planning, which is what some people on the right believe all socialism is just central planning. But you can see here that between democratic socialism and between market socialism, these are two alternatives where they mostly rely on the workers, they mostly rely on democracy, and they mostly rely on the market rather than to set prices rather than the state setting prices. So this is when we get into non-state or sometimes called decentralized socialism. We have democratic, we have market, and the next one, which is the most, I would say, extreme in some cases, which is heading towards anarchism in some cases, is libertarian socialism. And note that I will go through the more right-wing libertarians, like the Libertarian Party, things called minarchism, anarcho-capitalism, agorism, and all this kind of stuff we'll go through next week. But libertarian socialism is also a form of libertarianism and socialism, and it aims to create a society without political, economic, or social hierarchies, in which every person would have free, equal access to tools of information and production. This would be achieved through the abolition of authoritarian institutions and private property, so that direct control of the means of production and resources will be gained by the working class and society as a whole. Another term that some people call libertarian socialism is called anarcho syndicalism. If you speak French, you'll know that a syndicate or syndicate, something like this, is a union. So there's another version that I'll get into when we talk about anarchism that goes even further and talks about the unions owning the means of production. So we all organize ourselves into unions, and the unions get the means of production. So you can sort of see these nuances here. Democratic socialism is more about worker self-management, meaning that there would be no bosses like in these cooperatives. So there are no bosses. Nobody dictates anyone. Everything goes down to a direct democracy vote. And in this case, we have workers owning. They might have a leader, but they're not going to be like a dictatorial boss. And we have things like shared income and things like this, and no set prices. And then we have unions controlling the means of production. So they're very similar in that they don't rely as much on the state. They don't rely as much on central planning, but they all have these different nuances on how workers are going to work and who's going to be in charge of what and what distribution and on and on. Okay. The next one, pretty self-explanatory, is eco-socialism, called green socialism or socialism ecology. Again, think of it says here, the sort of mixing or emerging here aspects of Marxism, socialism, green politics, ecology, and anti-globalization. Eco-socialists or green socialists will advocate for a non-violent dismantling of capitalism and the state, focusing on collective ownership of the means of production in order to mitigate the social exclusion, poverty, and environmental degradation degradation brought about as they see it by the capitalist system, globalization, and imperialism. And so in this case, think of more environmentally focused socialism, where again the end goal is to dismantle capitalism because they see capitalism as the source of environmental degradation. We can definitely see tons of historical examples of that. If you read anything about London in the 19th century or any other major industrialized cities when there were no regulations, and again, some might point to those environmental regulations as a form of socialism, but in this case, they're going one more, which is they want to get rid of all capitalism. Globalization, of course, is a big one here, and imperialism, and thus kind of creating a very environmentally friendly socialist society. So again, it's one of these things where the adjective or the prefix, in this case, eco, is really what is determining the differences between the things. They all believe in socialism, but one is more democratic, one is more libertarian, one is more market driven, and this one is more focused on the environment. And last but not least, and there are a couple ones that you guys can go on to philosophybasics.com and look up, but I thought it was interesting to check out what not just Christian socialism, but religious socialism, because this is quite a big topic, especially again going back to 19th century and early 20th century, before there were things like Keynesian economics and the welfare state and the Nordic model and social security, and universal health care, and things that mainly happened either after World War One or after World War Two. Okay. So, from the Christian perspective, Christian socialism generally refers to those on the Christian left whose politics are both Christian and socialist, and who see these two things as being interconnected. So, Christian socialists draw parallels between what some have characterized as the egalitarian and anti-establishment message of Jesus, okay, and the message of modern socialism. So you can think of people like, I think his name was Cesar Chavez, who was a Latin American. He was American, excuse me, if I'm not mistaken. He was a Latino American man, Hispanic American man, who went to Mexico and South America and rallied a lot of support for farming unions. And I believe he was a Catholic priest, if I'm not mistaken, or had some kind of connection there. I might be wrong about that, but there have been a lot of left wing Catholic, especially clergy priests, as well as Protestant ministers and pastors, also on the left, who would characterize themselves as this. And if you know anything about Canadian history, um, in Canada, we have a church called the United Church of Christ, excuse me, the United Church of Canada, not to be confused with the United Church of Christ. But the United Church of Canada was an amalgamation of Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Methodists who, in the early 20th century, and this is probably before World War One, I think, were very left wing for those churches, okay, Presbyterian, Congregationalist, and Methodist. And they started their own church, their own united church by these, three denominations. And they mostly focused on things like social justice. And some of them have been very, influential on the universal healthcare system, including Baptists. Some very liberal Canadian Baptists also were involved, and of course Catholics and so forth. And there's a lot of people like that in the United States. If you are a Roman Catholic, you probably know there's something called, Catholic socialist thought, which is a whole thing again, which is a bit more beyond what I can characterize. When it comes to other religions, there is Jewish socialists. There are quite a few. In fact, most of the first Israeli people, the first people that established Israel, people like David Ben Gurion, Golda Meir, and many others were Jewish socialists. They, in fact, a lot of them established what are called the kibbutzim or the kibbutz, which are, of course, collective farming communities. They get subsidized, so they're not exactly perfect. But I have family who, some of them are very secular, some of them are very religious. And when they moved to Israel, they were on a kibbutz for quite a long time, and still live on a kibbutz. Again, some of them are very conservative, even though they're living a very socialist lifestyle, while others are, in some cases there were, communists and revolutionaries that have their own kind of kibbutzes, and it's a very interesting thing. So our form of Jewish socialism comes from what's called labor Zionism, and also comes from a lot of the first individuals who founded the state. There's also Islamic socialism. There's definitely a lot of people who are Arab nationalists, who are on the left. Don't mean to call out one bad example, but there was the Ba'athist Party in Iraq, which gave us Saddam Hussein. That being said, there's a lot of other Arab thinkers who weren't like that. But many Arab and Persian and Middle Eastern people looked at socialism as a form of decolonization. So that would happen, of course, in Palestine. That was happening in Israel. That was happening in Iraq. That would be happening also in Egypt, and especially Syria, and so forth over the times between World War One and World War Two, especially. So that was a big part. And there's Hindu socialism, there's Buddhist socialism, there's all types. And so that's the whole idea, is they're blending of these two things. Let's see here. Oh gosh, I've seen A Christmas Story. Yeah, I've seen it quite a bit. I've seen that quite a bit. That was filmed in Canada. It was filmed in the Niagara area. So, and I went to a museum because I lived in the Niagara area when I did my undergrad, and I went to a local museum, and they actually have the BB gun from that movie because they filmed it in the Niagara area, as I mentioned. I just mentioned that, sorry. But, they have the BB gun that's gonna poke your eye out. So I've seen that numerous amounts of times. I love that movie. My personal favorite, um, Christmas movies are Home Alone 1 and 2, Die Hard 1 and 2, and I watch those religiously. No pun intended. Cesar Chavez Day is an official in the state of California. Yeah, it was Cesar Chavez. Yeah, recognized for helping labor. It was Chavez because I get the Caesars. There's a couple of Caesars, so you have to forgive me, everyone. But yeah, Cesar Chavez was the right one that I said. And yes, his thing was he would go in buses with and he would go. 'Cause I saw a documentary about this when when I was in college, so he would take buses of people and they drive from the United States down to through Mexico, through South America to rally support for specifically unions in general, but I also think it was also what's it called? Farmers, if I'm not mistaken, was his focus. And again, please, someone look up if he was a priest or if he had some kind of clergy. I'm not sure. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but I definitely know he was at least a leader in the church. It speaks volumes about the state of both American politics and American Christianity that I've never heard of the phrase Christian socialism used in the media. Yeah, it's there's we hear a lot about the religious right. There is a religious left. I mean, there is. If you have near you a pork chop, if you have a Unitarian Universalist congregation, so it'll be called a Unitarian Church or Universalist Church, you're going to run into people that are mostly what they call religious humanists, but there are Christians who go to these congregations, and they're on the left. They vote Democrat or maybe Green Party or whatever. They're involved in social justice. They might believe in actual socialism. They might also just be politically progressive. But there are people, and there also are people in the Catholic Church, in Protestant churches, in the Orthodox churches. They are unfortunately pretty quiet uh, as far as the religious right. And remember that the religious right really only starts to take power in the 70s as a reaction to the 60s, because I mentioned last week when I talked about conservatism that most conservatives around around World War II, pardon me, even World War One, I should say, actually, around maybe the 20s, the 30s, but the 40s and the 50s, and even the early 60s were called paleo conservatives. And their whole thing was they want to be conservative as individuals, but they were not interested in forcing their conservative beliefs into public policy. And when the 60s happened, a lot of progressive and liberal policies were being influenced as public policy, and there was a reaction. And then Reagan comes in, neoliberalism comes in, and that really forces the religious right to start to assemble. You get the moral majority in the 80s, don't ask, don't tell in the 90s, and then, here we are. So there is a religious left. They are not as well funded, unfortunately, and they are not as popular because most people who are on the religious left are pretty liberal, which means that they're not out to convert people necessarily. They tend to be more personal, more quiet. I kind of think of myself as a religious liberal in that sense. Like when it comes to religion, I'm mostly a liberal. If you want to learn about Judaism again, we can talk. I'm not going to convert you because we don't proselytize. But like, it's my own personal thing. I do my thing. I believe in secular government and secularism and pluralism. So, separation of church and state. I have ideas about economics and stuff, but I don't want that to be forced on anyone. And it's kind of a tragedy that in the past, 40 years, the religious right has really blossomed and bloomed into something completely else. But yes, just understand that there are Christian socialists and every religion has their own version. Okay, I'm going to go back to full screen now, and we're going to talk about Marxism. So Marxism, by definition, is a pretty Simple idea here. Marxism is really the summation of the works of Karl Marx and, of course, also Friedrich Engels. And I mentioned before, I'll mention again, of course, Karl Marx and his philosophy has a lot to do with sociology, with economics, with history, and so forth. So it's not just political philosophy, it gets into other forms of social sciences and humanities. But what it really is based on, as far as the history is concerned, is what I've mentioned before. But according to Karl Marx, history had a purpose. That the purpose was that there were 5 stages of economies. We were in the third stage of capitalism. The next stage would be socialism, and after that would be communism. And so history itself was headed towards a revolution that people debate to this day. I say the revolution happened in Russia in 1917, and because it didn't have the characteristics of Marx, it kind of, you know, uh, makes Marx maybe not as reliable, or maybe whatever, maybe Karl Marx wasn't didn't predict it, whatever. That's my personal opinion. People are saying, no, there was never a revolution. It's still going to come. And look at all the things that are happening today. Karl Marx was right. Okay, we can, debate all those things, because I don't think Karl Marx was 100% right, but I certainly don't think he was 100% wrong. Both ways to be are a little naive. Same with Karl Popper, by the way, who I prefer. But we have these different forms. So those that adhered to the more strict form of classical Marxism or orthodox Marxism will read the original works from 1848 into the early 1880s, which and even into the 1890s, which were written specifically by Marx and Engels. Remember, Marx dies, he passes away in the early 1800s, early 1880s, and then I think for a few years after he died, 5-10 years after Marx died, Engels died. And so it was Marx who published the first volume of Das Kapital, and then Engels would publish volumes 2, 3, and 4. And I believe they were done after Marx had passed away. You can also read the collective works. There's the Communist Manifesto, which is a pamphlet. And so that's classical Marxism. So it's still waiting for the revolution, the next stage of socialism, and so forth. And again, I did get into a lot of this in my previous PowerPoint. Then along comes Marxism-Leninism, which we too discussed, which was the idea that instead of waiting around for the revolution to happen, there needs to be a vanguard party, a group of professional revolutionaries that would go into and possibly infiltrate unions and teachers and educational institutions and hospitals and factories and whatever, and they would essentially pump up the workers to start a revolution, to stimulate a revolution, and then that would be the revolution. So you don't have to wait for it. We can do some things in practical terms. And so those are the two most basic forms of I guess we could call historical Marxism. And although, again, I argue that we did have a Marxist revolution, it didn't happen in Western Europe, it happened in Russia, and it was stimulated by a lot of different things like Lenin and so forth. I still consider it to be the revolution, because it's the only one we've had practically. People who are still waiting for the revolution, maybe they're right. Maybe maybe there will be one, but I just don't think that waiting around for the revolution that was predicted in the 1840s is very practical. I think even though I don't like Marxism Leninism, it certainly is more practical. So that's my opinion. However, there are many different types of Marxism. I went over some briefly when we talked about what happened when the revolution didn't happen. But of course, most people today who consider themselves Marxists are not classical Marxists. There's very few. There are Marxist-Leninists. There's a Marxist-Leninist party in Canada, for example, which will appear every once in a while on a couple of electoral districts in Toronto or whatever, and usually in like Toronto Center, which is like the middle of downtown. and they might get 20 votes, they might get 100 votes for the Marxist-Leninist Party. Of course, there also is a Communist Party in Canada. It's one of the oldest, I think the second oldest party in the country after the Liberal Party. There's a Communist Party in the United States, of course, and I'm sure that there are other Marxist-Leninist parties and communist parties in the UK and all over the place. But here are some other viewpoints. So the first one is libertarian Marxism, and again, I will get into the libertarianism of the right wing next week. But libertarian Marxism is basically a school of Marxism that, after Stalin and after Lenin and after the establishment of the Soviet Union and some of the more authoritarian brands, libertarian Marxist theorists decided that they would like to see Marxism as not an authoritarian viewpoint. So they remove a lot of those authoritarian type things. And it's an entire school of thought. It says it emphasizes the ability of the working class to forge its own destiny without the need for a revolutionary party. So that would be like the vanguard, or a state like the Soviet Union or whatnot to mediate or to aid in its liberation. So it's then going back another step and saying, like, we don't need, we get Marxism, but Marxism, we're going to add liberty. And so we're not going to force the workers into doing certain things. The workers can do it themselves. So it almost re-emphasizes the organic nature of classical / orthodox Marxism. And of course, there's a big reaction to things like Marxism-Leninism, which has to have this vanguard. Next here is structural Marxism, and it says that this is based on an approach to Marxism that's based on the structuralism of the French theorist Louis Althusser. I don't know how to pronounce that. I think it's Althusser or Althusser if you're in French. It sounds like a German name to me. Maybe he was from the Alsace, I don't know. But regardless, he lived from 1918 to 1919, and he looks at a reanalyzing of Marxist ideas, which led him to realize that it provides not only a model of the economy, but also a description of the structure and development of a whole society. And it says it was influential in France, particularly in the late 60s and 70s. So in this case, we're looking at social structure. Anyone who sort of uses this word structuralism or structuralist, which can also be part of other philosophies that we learn about, have structural fill in the blank, and that's what they're talking about. So he's talking about structuring society within a Marxist perspective, especially structuring the economy in a Marxist perspective. Next, we have Neo-Marxism. Neo, of course, if you English is your second language or more than that, Neo, we refer to the word new, which I believe is Greek. So I believe it's Greek etymology of this prefix. So whenever we have a neo something, we talk about new. So this is new Marxism or neo-Marxism, and it's a 20th century, specifically from the 20th century and from the New Left, which was a group of thinkers, again, in the middle of the century that were rethinking left-wing politics and distancing themselves from things like Karl Marx and Marxism-Leninism, and trying to focus more on things like democratic socialism, Marxism, market socialism, pardon me, and other more democratic, non-violent forms of socialism. And again, very popular in the middle of last century, so around the 60s, 70s, and so forth. And it attempted to incorporate elements of modern psychology and sociology into orthodox Marxist thought. It rejected the perceived economic determinism, focusing instead on a non-physical psychological revolution, and it's more libertarian in nature. And it says it's also associated, if you ever heard of the Frankfurt School, which talks about things like postmodernism and so forth. Frankfurt School comes from the University of Frankfurt. It was a group of thinkers, mostly Marxists, and they established, a whole bunch of different educational theories and so forth. So think of this one, the new Marxism is a psychological revolution. So in order to have the revolution, the new idea was we have to sort of train ourselves to think like the revolution, right? Because or else we can't do it. We're not just going to wait around for a revolution. We're not going to stimulate the revolution unless we're kind of all thinking in a certain way. And that has to do a lot with education, psychology, and so forth. And then the libertarian aspect says it doesn't rely on authoritarianism in order to promote its ideas. After this, we have cultural Marxism. And this is another sort of 20th century a form of Marxism, which adds an analysis of the role of the media, art, literature, film, and other cultural institutions in a society, often with the added emphasis on race and gender in addition to class. So think about very influential forms of art. I mentioned also when I talked about Germany and the history of Germany after World War One, I spoke about an individual named Rosa Luxemburg. There's a theater named after her in Berlin, which at least, I mean, I don't know about today, it's hard to say, but at least at one point, that theater had a lot of Marxist inspired plays. And there were a lot of Marxist playwrights and filmmakers who would make movies and try to influence the culture again to go towards more of a Marxist bend. And I think Louis Buñuel, who was, if I'm not mistaken, I think that's how you pronounce it, his name, or Buñuel, he was a Spanish. I believe he was a Marxist, and he was a filmmaker responsible for a film called The Phantom of Liberty, and things like this. So, there was in France and Spain and Europe, there was a lot of this sort of new wave type of things, and a lot of Marxists actually added to those, cultural institutions to try to make visual media and so forth out of Marxism. Next, we have post-Marxism, and post in this case it means after. And it says here the theoretical work of philosophers and social theorists who have built their theories upon classical Marxism to some extent, but who have exceeded the limits of those theories in a way that puts them outside of Marxism. So in this case, a post fill in the blank ism usually starts with let's look at Marxism as a place to start. And then let's take other sources that can then influence Marxism and bring it up as well. And so we can see here, some of the theories that they started with Marx, but they didn't end with Marx. It's a little complicated, but you kind of get the idea. So we're going to start with some Marxist theories, but in the end, we might not end with pure Marxism. And then finally, the last two is we have Marxist humanism, which is a branch of Marxism that primarily focuses on Marx's earlier writings, in which he develops his theory of alienation, which is something I can talk about here, as opposed to his later works, which are concerned, which are considered to be, which are considered to, excuse me, considered and concerned are getting me a little frustrated here, which are considered to be concerned more with his structural conception of capitalist society. So what does that mean? When we talk about Marx as a sociologist, there is this idea of social alienation. So Karl Marx believed something that, again, this is why I'm challenged with. I don't think it's 100% right with this social alienation theory, but I definitely don't think it's 100% wrong, which is that in a capitalist society, which in the 1840s to the 1880s, people worked, there was no 40-hour work week. People worked, basically all day, every day, and they had very little time for their family. They had very, very little time for other, social things. And so the alienation was the more that you work, which again, I think there's some truth to this, the more that you work for a society in which you're giving up 60, 80, 100 plus hour work weeks, you alienate yourself. Now, I'm an ex-Scientologist, guys, you know this. When I was on staff, I worked in Berlin between 90 to over 100 hours. So when I learned about Marx's social alienation theory, a lot of it rang true because, of course, when I was working those hours on staff, I was alienating my family, I was alienating my friends, I was alienating myself, my health, and so there is a lot of truth to this, and that's why I'm always, like, yes, there is there are grains of truth and parts of it, and certainly his social alienation, has a lot of that. So this is why it's good, for example, that social democrats and progressives who are more liberal and more reformed gave us things like the 40-hour work week, vacation, et cetera, et cetera. And you can argue that in the United States, a lot of people want more vacation time. We get a lot of it here. In Europe, you don't get as much of it in the United States. Those are debates. And a lot of that does have to do with things like the mixed market and the Nordic model and so forth. So that's just one point. And then the last point here, Marx is, feminism. It's a branch of feminist theory which focuses on the dismantling of capitalism as a way to liberate women. And Marxist feminism asserts that private property is political confusion and ultimately unhealthy for social relationships between men and women, and is the root of oppression of women. So there you go. So we have these different kind of interesting aspects, um, of Marxism. And again, there's maybe some kernels of truth. I'm not going to say the whole thing is true, but there definitely are kernels. And some of those kernels are quite fascinating, and some of them might be a little too overgeneralized and whatnot. But I just think it's a good one. So this one here says from Huckleberry says, yeah, American Apocalypse covers the history of American evangelism or evangelicalism and its political history. I remember if that might be the one, that might be the one that I saw. There's also another one on Netflix that talks about the National Prayer Breakfast, if that's the same one, Huckleberry, because that was a really good one. Just there's this thing called the National Prayer Breakfast, and the organization that runs that is like very evangelical. It started, I guess, whenever, maybe 100 years ago, less than that, and like every president has participated in this National Prayer Breakfast, and how it's basically like a cabal of like very powerful evangelicals and stuff like this. Oh, American Apocalypse is a book. Okay, we'll read the book. Yes, I'm getting it confused with other things, but there's been a lot of really good deep dives into the religious right and so forth. And so, yeah, basically, that is the end of my presentation. I hope that you all enjoyed it. And again, please go to philosophybasics.com for more information. This is just me breaking down some of the more popular types and so forth, which I think is interesting. And was we have talked about it before on at least three or four, more previous, videos from the past. And these are always interesting subjects, these political subjects, because a lot of people don't really read the dictionary, and that's the Scientologist in me that I think is one of the only things that they taught me that was what was good was in order to get on the right page or the same page with someone, we need to at least start somewhere. And I always think starting with the dictionary definition is a good thing, because you say socialism to some people and they think that it's responsible for everything good in the world. You talk to some people there, they think it's responsible for all the evil in the world, and both of those are not true. There's a lot of nuanced gray areas that we can pick apart. And yes, certainly, I'm no fan of the Soviet Union or or even of Yugoslavia, but there's a lot of nuanced differences. We shouldn't all just plump everything into one massive category and say it's good, it's bad. Mark, if you want to test your knowledge in about 4 hours, the Cultology twins will be having a game night. 4 hours from now, it's going to be 2 a.m. And unfortunately, I don't think I will be able to. Um, but you have told me about them before, and I would like to do it. I know there, you said one of them at least is in Australia, but if they do it at a time that I can do it, whether it's coming up or in the new year, I would love to, absolutely love to. So thank you, Peter. I really appreciate it. It's just, yeah, 4 hours from now is going to be too late, and I won't be up just because of my time zone. but I do appreciate the thought. So I wanted to conclude again by giving you the schedule. I know I put this at the front of our of today's live, but I'm going to do it at now. So the next time we're going to meet is going to be on the 11th, which is Wednesday, and we're going to do a very special episode, very special live, because it is the 1 year anniversary of the passing of my friend and our friend Doug Scott Kramer. And I'm going to talk about Doug, me meeting Doug, what he meant to me. We're going to talk about some of the videos that we did, some things that I wanted to do with Doug, and things like this. That unfortunately we never got around to, but I'm going to, do a memorial, a celebration of his life. And in addition to that, there might be some other channels that do something similar next week. And so I may participate in that. I will let you know hopefully by next week if I hear from people, but there should be, a 1 year anniversary celebration. And I'm going to do mine, and other people will probably do a version of theirs. So please, always remember our friend Doug, and come by next week for that. 1 week from now, which of course is what is the date? Is the 14th of December. I'm going to do a PowerPoint on libertarianism and anarchism. So we're going to look at different things like minarchism, anarcho-capitalism, anarcho-communism, anarcho-syndicalism, social libertarianism, and agorism and mutualism and Georgism and all this kind of cool stuff. So um, yeah, I think we'll have some fun doing that, I guess, and dropping some knowledge on that. And then after that, on the 18th, we will do the second part of the various types of history. I will talk about political history, social history, economic history, business history, etc., etc., etc. Pete, thank you so much. I will check that out at Scientology Crimes. That's cool. I'm going to try to get one of the reasons I've been sort of reluctant on almost like getting my name out there and going on other channels is just because I've been busy, but that's something I want to do more in the new year. So a goal for me is to go on more channels. I've had some really good help. I'm getting subscribers from Marilyn. She's probably responsible for getting me more than half of my subscribers. I've been posting on different forums and stuff, and I get some traction, which is good. I hope they get some traction with these types of stuff. I got good traction with my Twilight Zone episode and my Russian minorities episode and the German history episodes and the Yugoslavian history episodes. So hopefully, by doing more of these broader kind of definition and breakdown topics, I can get into to more members. But I'm definitely going to work on that. Not just this month, but also in the new year. So one of my New Year's resolutions would be to try to get more subscribers and be more active on other people's channels. So that's something you can look forward to. And I'll always, of course, mention things on my community tab. So please go over there and look things up. We're not going to have a poll, but I will be posting obviously through this month and even through the break, updating you guys on what's been going on. So if you want to know anything like that, go over there on my community tab. Um, and after that, I just want to say thank you to everyone who joined today. Thank you to all my subscribers. Please, if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, you can do so now. I would really appreciate it. And of course, please like this video if you haven't already. I want to wish everyone a good week, rest of your weekend, and a very, very good week next week. And we'll see each other on Wednesday. And of course, in case I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.